few weeks ago, I announced initial reforms to the International Student Program, including the development of a new framework to recognize learning institutions that provide top quality services and support, including housing to international students. It would be a mistake to blame international students for the housing crisis, but it'd also be a mistake to invite them to come to Canada with no support, including how to put a roof over their heads. It's why we expect learning institutions to only accept a number of students that they're able to provide for, able to house or assist in finding off-campus housing. In welcoming international students, we have a responsibility to make sure that students are supported when they come to our country. We also want to ensure that international students don't become victims of unscrupulous individuals who offer them inadequate living conditions, sometimes even at inflated prices. Ahead of September 2024, we are prepared to take necessary measures, including significantly limiting visas to ensure that designated learning institutions provide adequate and sufficient student supports as part of the academic experience. In order to achieve this result, it is imperative that we work together with provincial and territorial governments, learning institutions, and other education stakeholders so we can ensure international students are set up for success in Canada. Enough is enough. If provinces and territories cannot do this, we will do it for them, and they will not like the bluntness of the instruments that we use. Our aim is to strike the right balance between welcoming international students and making sure they have all they need to thrive. I will communicate more on this in due course, but for today, I'm here to announce a few more immediate measures. International students need to be prepared for life in Canada, and we have a responsibility to make certain that they are well supported when they come to Canada. Mais les exigences relatives au coût de la vie pour les demandeurs de permis d'études n'ont pas changé depuis le début des années 2000, établi à l'époque à 10 000 $ par demandeur. Ce chiffre n'a clairement pas suivi le rythme de coût de la vie au fil du temps, ce qui fait que quelques étudiants arrivant au Canada apprennent qu'ils n'ont pas de fonds suffisants pour terminer l'année scolaire. So starting on January 1st of next year, in 2024, the financial requirement for study permits will be raised to reflect the current cost of living. And as such, a single applicant will need to show that they have $20,635 in funds to support themselves in Canada, moving up from $10,000, as I mentioned in French. Moving to a more accurate cost of living level that helps international students arrive with necessary resources to live and study in Canada. Future increases will be tied to the low income cutoff that Statistics Canada publishes every year, similar to other immigration programs. This cutoff conveys the income below which an individual may be in strained circumstances as they have to spend a greater than average proportion of their income on necessities. Recognizing that students already have to show that they can cover their tuition as well as their travel costs, their cost of living threshold is set at 75% of the low income cutoff rather than 100%, and puts us on par with our competitor countries. Ce changement aidera les étudiants étrangers à faire face aux difficultés financières qu'ils rencontrent au Canada et les protégera contre la vulnérabilité et l'exploitation, afin qu'ils puissent se concentrer évidemment sur leurs études. Cela permettra également de garantir qu'ils disposent de ressources financières dont ils ont besoin pour prospérer, afin qu'ils puissent rester au Canada s'ils le souhaitent. Nous reconnaissons le fait que les incidences de changement du changement sur les étudiants éventuels pourraient varier, tels que ceux issus de milieux ou de lieux moins privilégiés. So next year, we intend to implement targeted pilots that will test new ideas aimed at helping underrepresented cohorts of international students to pursue their studies in Canada. And we also plan to work with institutions, provinces, and territories to provide students with what they need to succeed. And I will have more to say on this a little earlier on in 2024. I'd also like to update you on 3 temporary policies affecting international students that were set to expire by the end of the year. The main purpose for an international student to be in Canada is to study. However, since most students are currently halfway through their school year and some are working full-time to meet their needs, we will extend the temporary policy that has allowed eligible international students to work more than 20 hours per week through till April 30th of 2024, the end of the academic year. We're currently examining options for this policy in the future, but we know that 40 hours a week is untenable if you're a student, and are looking to potentially expand off-campus work hours for international students up to 30 hours per week while class is in session. Our data shows us that 80% of international students or more work more than 20 hours a week. Nous prolongeons également la mesure autorisant les étudiants étrangers à inclure le temps passé à étudier en ligne dans la durée de tout futur permis de travail post-diplôme qu'ils recevront, à condition que cette partie en ligne représente moins de la moitié de la durée totale de leur programme d'études. We first implemented distance learning measures in 2020 due to the travel restrictions during the pandemic and reduced them in scope in September of 2022. But since the vast majority of international students are now actually studying in person in Canada, we're extending this measure only to those starting programs before September 1st of 2024. And finally, in response to the labor market disruptions over the pandemic, we introduced a temporary policy granting post-graduation work permit holders an additional 18-month open work permit if needed. Those with a post-graduate work permit expiring by the end of this year remain eligible to apply, and we won't be extending that policy after that. Grâce à l'augmentation longtemps attendue du seuil relatif au coût de la vie et à la prolongation des mesures de facilitation temporaire, les étudiants arrivant au Canada disposeront d'une assise financière plus solide lorsqu'ils commenceront leurs études. Protecting and supporting international students from becoming vulnerable, whether that's to bad actors or simply meeting their needs in Canada, is one of the main goals of our review of the International Student Program. These students contribute to boosting Canada's economy. Taking these additional steps today contributes to our long-term goal, which is to preserve the integrity of the International Student Program. It'll be key in all this to work with our provincial and territorial counterparts, which have an important share of the jurisdiction and responsibility in this, as well as other education and stakeholders, including the learning institutions themselves, so that we can ensure that international students really are set up for success in Canada. Thank you, and on that, I'm glad to take your questions.
Qu'est-ce que vous espérez régler avec ça? Parce que vous avez semblé un peu montrer du doigt les provinces et territoires qui ne faisaient pas tout à fait leur travail. Ce que vous avez énuméré, qu'est-ce que ça va régler? Puis peut-être aussi aborder le fait qu'en passant de 10 000 à 20 000 $, c'est clair qu'il y a des gens de certains pays qui ne seront plus ou qui vont être exclus par défaut.
Ben, écoutez, c'est clair que c'est pas n'importe qui peut s'avérer des ressources pour venir au Canada pour étudier. Ça ne veut pas dire pour autant que ces gens-là ne sont pas intelligents, qui ne participeraient pas nécessairement à l'épanouissement intellectuel de notre pays. Évidemment, de travailler au Canada, de devenir peut-être des résidents permanents et des citoyens. Mais c'est clair que le niveau de la vie, puis le seuil qu'on imposait de 10 000 $ date d'une vingtaine d'années. Il faut bien que les gens qui veulent venir au Canada sachent ce à quoi s'attendre, et surtout dans une atmosphère d'abordabilité et les défis que ça présente, que ça soit le coût de la vie généralement ou le prix du loyer. C'est clair que les gens qui postulent au Canada doivent savoir ce à quoi s'attendre et doivent démontrer les capacités financières de pouvoir s'établir ici. Alors, il y a un équilibre à atteindre. C'est la raison pour laquelle on va regarder des projets pilotes pour s'assurer que certains pays défavorisés, certains lieux défavorisés, certains étudiants qui auraient de plein droit ou la capacité de s'épanouir au Canada puissent le faire. Mais c'est clair que dans le contexte, il fallait absolument agir pour s'assurer que ce seuil de 10 000 $, qui était bien en delà du seuil de nos compétiteurs et des pays auxquels on fait de la compétition, qu'on soit à ce niveau. Donc, c'était quelque chose qui était attendu depuis longtemps. Et puis, espérons, et je pense que ça va contribuer de surcroît avec les mesures qu'on a mises en place à date et ceux que les provinces mettront en place, va continuer d'enrayer la fraude qui sévit à travers le système. Vous avez parlé de la responsabilité des provinces. Il y a un défi de juridiction dans tout ça. Mais sachez que du côté financier, le Canada, à court terme, n'obtient aucun bénéfice. Ce sont les provinces qui prennent une mesure des frais et ce sont les institutions qui sont désignées par les provinces qui prennent la majorité des frais. Il y a de l'abus, c'est de l'abus qui doit être enrayé et c'est surtout de la responsabilité des provinces de le faire.
Minister, you referred to the universities not liking the bluntness of some of the instruments that you might use. What did you mean by that, and what do you expect universities to do?
Well, so Rafi, I mentioned institutions themselves, and they have a very large portion of the responsibility in making sure that the student experience is properly reflected in the resources that they're given, whether it's providing housing, whether it's providing proper health supports, and a proper academic experience, there is a responsibility on behalf of the provinces that designate the learning institutions in question to make sure that those are actually the institutions that are worthy of getting visas from the government of Canada. There are, in provinces, the diploma equivalent of puppy mills that are just churning out diplomas. And this is not a legitimate student experience. There is fraud and abuse, and it needs to end. There have been, when you take, for example, the province of Ontario, there have been Auditor General reports that have recommended some very important measures that have not been put into place, and that has contributed to the abuse. So the bluntness of the instruments that we have at the federal government level, in addition to the fraud task forces, is the strict removal of visas, which can have a number of effects and can have ripple effects, whether we designate a particular institution in particular or whether we simply take other measures to significantly reduce this. The federal government can't do it alone because our measures and the measures that we have, the policies that we have, can have ripple effects on what the portrait of an international student experience could look like, and we could potentially miss the mark. Provinces have a number of tools at their disposal, namely the regulation of the designated learning institutions that, in some cases, just need to be shut down.
On the subject of working hours extension, have you taken a look at what impact that extension could have on permanent residents in Canada who are competing for those same jobs with the students?
Are you talking about the work hours?
Yeah.
Well, look, there's labor shortages across the country. The measure that was put into place during COVID was one that was designated to make sure that those shortages were being addressed. It was popular. We had heard legitimately from students that a 20-hour work week is doable and is something that people could actually study at the same time and work 20 hours. Also, employers were looking for people that could potentially commit for over 20 hours and perhaps only work 20, so it was limiting the availability for students out there. It is costly to be a student in Canada, so having that flexibility and dealing with those two competing public policies, I think, was one of the challenges that we're still juggling with. We know that over 80% of international students are factually working over 20 hours, but 40 hours is just untenable. It is not credible that someone, except for rare occasions, could work a full work week and actually study at the same time. I know, having done it myself, and I know lots of people that have worked very hard, but those 40-hour work weeks drain you, and it is not reflective of a proper student experience. But there is flexibility, and we were looking at an hour category in and around 30 hours, but it hasn't been decided yet. So given the financial pressures that current students in Canada would be feeling had we taken a decision to roll it back to 20 hours, it didn't make sense and would probably perhaps put more strain on students that are currently struggling to make ends meet. I don't think students are taking jobs away from other people given the labor shortages that are happening in Canada. My focus primarily is to make sure that the public policy that we have in place is one that reflects the ability of the student to actually do what they're supposed to be doing, which is study, without bankrupting themselves. So there's a middle ground there that we need to look at. I'm going to look at more data with my team to make sure that something like 30 hours actually makes sense. But currently, with the data that we know, rolling it back to 20 hours would have been on the draconian end of the spectrum.
A related question to your file.
This will mean that there will be fewer international students coming in because you've raised the financial requirements for people to come to Canada. Do you have any models or numbers on that?
We're currently looking at that, Mackenzie. It is what it is. The reality is that we need an international student program that is robust. Clearly, we compete with other countries for some of the top talent, but clearly we have become a country that has been targeted for abuse and exploitations by some unsavory actors, and we need to be able to address that head on, and I think provinces need to be able to address that head on. And these measures are intended to shore up the integrity of the system. For now, I'm not worried about the absolute number. What I'm worried about is the students, and to make sure that they have the proper student experience and that they are indeed studying, and that the unscrupulous institutions that exist today that aren't actually learning institutions, but are a conduit for money going to some people that want to profit off them, and potentially some backdoor entries to Canada, are effectively shut down.
On another topic, the Americans are considering imposing visa bans on extremist Israeli settlers. There's calls for the EU to do that. Is Canada considering something similar?
Look, people that commit crimes aren't welcome in Canada, and the differences that we have in how we deal with specific situations that are occurring around the world and the policy tools that we have in Canada vis-a-vis the ones that the U.S. use are slightly different. We don't want people that have committed crimes, particularly crimes of this egregious nature, given the geopolitical context, make their way into Canada. Canada has typically adopted a case-by-case basis, but it's information that we are working with the U.S. on. We aren't always lockstep on our approach with the U.S., but in this case, I think we could agree that people that commit crimes of this nature should not be welcome in Canada.
Minister, new data shows that Canada's, on average, is deporting 39 undocumented migrants or people a day. That's up from 2 years ago. What is your government's strategy? You had a promise to provide undocumented workers status in Canada. Where is that plan?
The promise remains. I have told, I've been quite public in saying that this is something that I will be bringing to Cabinet in the spring. It will not address all the challenges of people that are here on an irregular basis and undocumented. There's a large group of people in Canada that are Canadian by any other name that just don't have the documentation that we need to address in a mature fashion. There is resistance within the system. I would not say to you that there is unanimity in Parliament as to how to approach. There's a number of competing policies that we have to be quite, I think, wide-eyed about in how we approach this, notably in the context of the winds that have turned against immigration and the sense that these folks, and I resist that characterization, but I don't resist the fact that it exists, would be considered queue jumpers. I think that's kind of distasteful to consider it as such at times, but I think we do have to have a comprehensive policy that addresses hundreds of thousands of people that are here in Canada, and but for the fact that that they're Canadians by any other name, and I think we need to do that in a smart fashion. I wouldn't say that necessarily, and I do not want to question whether this has an impact on the people that are being asked to leave Canada. We know that there have been challenges, particularly through COVID, in enforcing departures, given the context. So you'd have to compare data points, but I think that Canada needs to move forward with a path to regular migration, and it's something that I've committed to take in front of Cabinet in the spring. But it isn't a foregone conclusion, and it is not one that comes without cost or without considerations of other factors dealing with the perception around queue jumping that people seem to be more and more sensitive to these days. But it's something I'm working on.
People in the first 2 quarters alone, right? Like that's close to the total in 2021 and 2022 years where the pandemic was in place. So what is going on?
Sorry, ask the question again, Raf.
7,032 people in the first 6 months of 2023 alone. That's almost the same for the totals in 2021 and 2022. The pandemic was in place at that point. So what's going on? Like, are you at war with the CBSA? Like, what's happening?
That's a question for the CBSA principally, but it is not the case that everyone that is in this country is entitled to stay in Canada. And I think for the same concerns about the integrity of the system that I was talking about earlier, we need a process that is enforceable once due process is accorded. I wouldn't say that CBSA doesn't have its challenges, that said, and when we deal with deportations, it first and foremost has to be done in a humane fashion after as in any country like ours, the due process is accorded.
Il faut revenir en français sur ce que vous avez expliqué à mon collègue, le fait que les provinces ont une responsabilité de ne pas favoriser la création de ce qui ressemble à des usines à chaux, des établissements qui ont des faux diplômes et qui profitent d'étudiants.
Mais dans certains cas, dans certaines provinces, il y a des machines à diplôme, puis c'est la réalité. Ce sont des endroits où il y a de l'exploitation, peut-être des portes arrière d'entrée au Canada, les gens qui profitent du système. Je vise pas les étudiants eux-mêmes. Il y a beaucoup d'exploitation. Les gens ont vu quelque chose de financièrement très lucratif et en ont pris profit. Alors, ce sont des institutions qui sont de juridiction provinciale. La désignation de ces institutions en est une qui est de la compétence provinciale et doit être réglementée par la province. Et il y a eu des rapports de vérificateurs provinciaux qui en ont dit autant avec des recommandations qui n'ont pas été mises en place. Alors, c'est la réalité de la chose et ces provinces ont le devoir et l'obligation d'agir et dans certains cas extrêmes de fermer ces institutions. Ça a été fait par le passé, ça doit continuer parce que les étudiants qui viennent ici, je ne pense pas qu'ils veulent être caractérisés du même coup de pinceau de gens qui viennent ici puis n'ont pas de raison légitime d'être au Canada. Reste encore que c'est un travail qui doit être fait de façon minutieuse. Les outils, les instruments dont dispose le Canada en tant qu'entité fédérale sont des instruments qui sont très bruts, c'est-à-dire restreindre, ne pas émettre des visas, quitte à avoir des fermetures totales d'institutions. Je pense que les provinces sont mieux placées pour agir, mais faute duquel le fédéral est prêt à agir.
Gaza, there are still Canadians stuck in Gaza. What other options, if any, are there for the government to try to speed up getting those Canadians out of Gaza?
Continued advocacy with the parties in question. I mean, we are in hourly contact with officials on the ground advocating for Canadians' permanent residents and the extended configurations of their families to get out. We regularly advocate for people that are on our list, and it's one that's not complete. I mean, this is the most dangerous place in the world to be in right now, in a humanitarian catastrophe. So it's work that my team and Minister Jolie's team at Global Affairs is working on a daily basis to try and get people out. It is sometimes really just game time decisions. Windows open at Rafah Gate and windows close quite quickly, and there are about 2 or 3 different moving parts and different actors who, when they're not doing that, are attacking each other that have a say in this, and it's something that is very, very, very difficult on the ground and frustrating when those windows open and then close without getting our people out. But we have folks on the ground trying to get people out.
Minister, I was hoping you could address allegations of discriminatory policy. We are hearing from Palestinian Canadians who want extended families out of Gaza, and they're being told that their non-Canadian grandchildren do not qualify, whereas Israeli Canadians who asked for non-Canadian grandchildren to be extricated from Israel as the war was coming and after the war were given that latitude and those exit visas. Can you address that at all, whether or not that discriminatory policy exists? Because we do have at least one family who was told originally that their non-Canadian grandchildren could get out, but then was denied after approval.
I'd have to look into that specific allegation. It's hard to speculate. We are just trying to get people out as quickly as possible, and I'm currently looking into options to expand the categories of people that we can continue to advocate for that have a connection to Canada. Clearly, when it comes to children, that is something that we would want to make sure we are being proactive in trying to get out.
Why would they be denied, though, in terms of children? It seems like, initially...
Well, I think it doesn't make sense to deny children. We have a limited window to advocate for a limited group of people in a different context. We are talking about a war zone, and it's one where we have tried our best to be flexible, and mistakes are made at times, and with the effect that it costs sometimes people's lives. But we want to be as flexible as possible, and indeed, I'm currently working on options to be more flexible. As much as we advocate, as much as we put in place a policy, as much as we perhaps even issue visas, it isn't a guarantee that those people will actually get out. And it has been the case at times where we have had people on our list that we were not able to extract, as frustrating as it is.
Are you saying that non-Canadian relatives of people here in Gaza will be eligible for visas to come to Canada or not?
We're currently working on a number of options. I can't disclose them at this time, but it's work that's ongoing.
financial
Can I
requirements
just ask
that
one
you
more question, please?
were putting on.
Let's not familiar.
Yeah,
You've been quiet up to now.
You hinted that you might be looking at potentially withdrawing visas from colleges, as you call them, puppy mill colleges. Can you say if you're thinking about a deadline for provinces to get their act together?
We want people to get their act together by the September 2024 school year. I mean, this is not something that we can't give people a reasonable amount of time on. The proper policy instruments to investigate, to enforce some recommendations that have been out there for a long time needs to be done, I think, judiciously, because, like I said, when you use a blunt instrument, there can be consequences that are unanticipated. But at this stage, as we've said, really enough is enough, and it's time to get our acts together as a country.
You're planning to raise the financial requirement for people who want to come and study here. I know a lot of times international students run into problems getting the money here for one reason or another. You know, they have it back home. There are restrictions or limits that stop them from transferring it here. Have you thought about any kind of a test or threshold for making sure that money can actually get to Canada as part of that?
Yeah, and I would add to that there are people that play games and will shift money from bank accounts to build sort of the financial solvency requirements, and then it wasn't there in the first place. You know, from the countries that we get people from, as talented as they are, we know that sometimes people will pool their money and put all their hopes into a kid that is bright and could be the future of this country, but also the future of the family in question. So, you know, it is frustrating, and I think that is some of the reflection that we put into raising the financial thresholds. What will people do to circumvent this? We have no choice but to raise it, given that it's been about 20 years that we did it. But we certainly look at these issues and say, well, obviously, if we're raising to $20,635, we want the person to be able to use it once they're here. It's sort of the interplay that we've had with respect to the work hours and play and how we carefully balance that. You will find, as our